Welcome to another episode of Innovation and the Future of Pharmacovigilance, a podcast series brought to you by Trilliant Talks. I'm your host, Indiana Walia, and I'm delighted to navigate the dynamic world of pharmacovigilance and risk management with you. A quick disclaimer, the opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of the individual guest and do not necessarily reflect the official views of Trilliant Consulting or their company. We're all about fostering insightful conversations here at Trilliant Talks, and we want you to know that any product, vendor, or service mentioned does not imply an endorsement. If you're seeking professional advice for specific situations, we encourage you to go to our experts. Please remember this podcast content is meant for informational and educational purposes only. Right, today we are incredibly lucky to have the wonderful Tony De Sousa, Global Head of Countries and Regions at Novartis, as our guest speaker. Tony, thank you for joining us on this podcast.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you for having me. I really appreciate
it. We're really lucky to have you. And I guess I really want to start by asking the question in PV, which is, how did you get into PV?
So it's really funny because, and I'll get into my background a little bit further, but I'm a nurse by trade, an ER nurse. And when I was working in the emergency room, it's funny because I had no idea about PV, none. And I remember, over 20 years ago, getting an adverse event form. And I remember throwing it in the garbage and saying, I don't know what the heck this is, and literally put it in the garbage. And then a few years later, one of my colleagues from nursing school had reached out to me and said, hey, by the way, I'm working at a pharmaceutical company and I'm doing, A, B, and C in AE collection and drug safety. And I was like, oh, that sounds interesting because, the lifespan within the emergency room is usually, 70% turnover within 2 years. And I was there for 4+ years and over 6, 7-ish altogether. And I kind of stumbled into it. And I took a contractor role as an entry-level associate clinical safety associate at the time, and basically doing due diligence, for adverse event reporting and following up with healthcare professionals. And then I got a permanent position as a data management specialist, which I wasn't a data manager. I had to learn, data management, but I did that. And that's kind of how I stumbled into it. And then I realized that, wow, there's a whole career out there that I can, kind of explore. And that's kind of how I stumbled into it.
And your career obviously took off from that point within PV. What did you think you would end up to be at that point so early on in your career? Or was it just all brand new to you?
It was all brand new to me. And my goal was to become like an associate director, ultimately, down the road, 20, 30 years. But it kind of worked out a little bit better than I thought. Right. As my career progressed, so did my responsibilities. And fortunately, I was able to get to a level where I am right now as head of countries and regions. And I'm not sure if you want me to go through the different steps because there were multiple steps.
I mean, I think your career was very interesting because in the majority you've stayed at Novartis for pretty much most of your career, but you did have a slight secondment out, I believe, at some point in your career to Bayer, was it?
Yeah, that's correct. So as I grew in my career and responsibilities within Novartis, I was exposed to many different things. right? Locally and globally. And also when I realized that I needed further education, right? To build within the organization and within the industry. And when I evaluated, okay, what's the best educational path to provide, a career path for me? And, I solicited feedback from the people that I trusted within the organization and outside of the organization. And, it was funny, it came up, an MBA, an MPH, because I had a BSN in nursing. And then I found a program that had an MBA and an MPH. And, at that time in my life, I was 27 ish, had one child, one on the way. And, I told my wife, and I was still working in the ER.
Wow.
Okay. So I was working full time at Novartis, and I realized, that's what's in the best interest for me and my family. And my wife was really supportive. At the time, she's like, go for it. So I found this dual program and I said, oh, it's going to take like 6-7 years. And she's like, go for it. And I did. And I got an MBA, I got an MPH. And it kind of, really enlightened me that there's different things besides just being a nurse, and I learned a lot of different skill sets, and I kind of grew within my career at Novartis. And with the MBA, to your point as to why I left to Bayer, there was an opportunity there to be a team leader, and I wanted management experience.
I see.
And I went there for a year, and I had a team of, I think it was like 8 to 10 people. But I realized that the culture wasn't aligned with what really I wanted to pursue. Mm-hmm. And I came back to Novartis, and I took, 2 steps back as a senior clinical safety scientist. And it kind of grew from there. I did that for a few years, and then I got hired into the global R&P role, risk management role, which was evolving at that time in 2010 with the regulations from the European health authorities and other health authorities that have since evolved that really wanted, R&Ps, and especially R&Ps that are submitted with dossiers, PSURs, et cetera. And I wrote the templates at the time.
Wow.
Yeah. And based on the regulations and the demands from other health authorities. And I did that for approximately 3 years. And then, fortunately, they believed in me, and it was a big step in my career at a relatively young age after I graduated with my MBA and my MPH. And I was, one of the first non-physicians to be named the head of the country patient safety head for the U.S., which is the head of safety in essence for the U.S., with regional responsibilities for Canada. So the country patient safety head reported to me as well. Mm-hmm. But then I got, when we took over GSK, the oncology division, and then Sandoz and Alcon, I was also the head for all of those different, avenues within Novartis.
All for the US or for globally?
US and Canada at that time. US
and Canada.
From 2013 to 2018.
And at that, there's a raft of big demergers and mergers happening right now. Obviously, you've been involved with in recent history and past history. How was that to you when you had these new organizations coming with their own structures and you overseeing all of these different areas or all these new departments from a new acquisition?
Well, it wasn't acquisition per se. It was a merger within the Novartis family. It was very difficult because, you had my equivalent at Alcon, you had my equivalent at Sandoz, not only within the US, but within Canada. And so we had 6 different locations, right? We had East Hanover for pharma and oncology for Novartis. Then in Alcon in Texas, we had a country patient safety head there. And then in Broomfield, Colorado for Sandoz, we had a country patient safety head there and a whole team. And they were centrally located, which means they did central case processing for all of Sandoz. Then we had Toronto that had Alcon, a smaller team there, and Boucherville, that was Sandoz, that had a relatively large team, and then the Novartis team at Sandoz that was right outside Boucherville in Dorval. So it was quite difficult to marry, these different cultures, different experiences. We're talking about the generic, Alcon, very vision focused. So it was very difficult to marry them. And when I was announced that I was taking over all of it, it took a lot of travel to go into the different locations. But it was very successful in nature once we realized that we had one common goal. The organization had a common goal. And in my view, we had the right leadership at the time to merge everything. And it was very successful. And that's evident by, if we look at the successful inspections, audit outcomes, but it was a lot of work, right? Yeah. When you're marrying procedures, right, cultures, it is quite difficult, and it takes time. And a lot of people, especially senior leaders, they expect things to happen like that.
Correct. Yes.
And they don't happen like that. It takes time, effort, evaluating the capabilities of the leaders that you're taking over. And sometimes those capabilities didn't marry with what we wanted for future goals. So we had to make changes. But ultimately, if you have the right vision, the right support, and given some of the caveats that's going to go in between, it was actually quite successful.
And after that successful part of your career, you then moved on to be your current position now, which is the global head of regions. And I wonder, is there that same sort of dynamic there where, it's about marrying cultures and looking at things slightly differently, probably on a bigger scale, even from just the US and Canada?
Yeah. And so it's funny because I was in my boss's succession plan at the time. But it was a clear understanding that, potentially me moving to Basel, because it's a global role, was not in the cards for me, per se. And then when I spoke with my wife and my family, it's like, it's a good opportunity, potentially. But I turned it down because I said, you know what? We're going to stay here, right? We have a great family unit. And, moving to Basel is not in the cards. And then at the time, the global head came back to me and said, you know what? We want you, and you could stay in the US, and we'll evaluate after a year. And I took the role. Fortunately, I'm a Portuguese citizen. My wife is, all 4 of my kids. And, pre-COVID, we decided, okay, we're not going to move to Basel, but Lisbon, yes. Yeah. We had the infrastructure within Portugal, and my family and her family, and we were going to move there. And unfortunately, COVID happened.
And, the big C word.
Yeah. And, that kind of, was put on hold. and we stayed obviously in the U.S. And kind of evolved. And the culture shock was when you're, even though I spent a lot of time in Europe and I traveled a ton. One of the things that I realized as a global leader was how much I didn't know. Mm-hmm. Culturally, right? I had not been to Africa. I had not been to the Middle East, India, like all of these different cultures, which dynamics really change you as a leader. Mm-hmm. And it opens your eyes. And it's been the most wonderful 5 years traveling all around the world and shaping me as not only a human being, more importantly, and impacting it on my kids and sharing those lessons learned. And I could see the difference. But as a leader, right? And adapting to the different evolving regulatory environment in the different parts of the world. And one of the things that I've realized in PV is that we focus on the big health authorities.
Correct. Yeah.
And what I realized is now the evolving health authorities, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Africa, like they really are demanding in nature and becoming more and more demanding. China, Japan, and they're departing from the big three, the big four, the big five, and doing really domestic related type of regulatory, demands and environments and inspecting us. And that's where I've had to learn and adjust. And fortunately, we've done so really successfully. In the past 15, 16 months, we've had, I think it's about 19 PV inspections. Forget about GCP and GNP inspections that PV is always pulled into.
Yeah.
No critical findings.
Wow.
No fines. And that's really, a testament to our preparation. And we've done a really good job of that. And, the proof is in the pudding.
So there are a couple of things I've got off the back of that. The first one I actually wanted to talk about, just taking a couple of steps back from some of your comments about your move and potential, lack of move to Basel, and then your potential move to Lisbon, and COVID getting in the way. But do you think COVID in a weird way allowed you to be the global head much more effectively, because companies were then saying, people could technically work from anywhere? We all knew it, but did it become more prevalent because of COVID? Did it become easier even? Oh,
yes. And this is the funny thing and I tell people all the time is, I have over, 700 associates, right, in 82 countries. Okay. That's just FTEs. What I found with COVID, which was I didn't expect this, was our talent pool. Because we weren't restricted from a locality perspective. In other words, in the Netherlands, I could hire somebody 100 kilometers away from the home office. Our talent pool opened up tremendously. And I was able to hire in the Netherlands, in Italy, in China. I can't even tell you how many countries. I mean, the list is extensive. And they are all still there. And we were able to expand our horizons in our talent pool, and it worked out wonderfully. For me personally, it was really nice because I didn't have to travel as much.
Yeah.
Right? And I was traveling about 60%. And just to give you an example, in January of 2020, I did 32,000 miles.
Whoa.
Yes. In just January of 2020, right before COVID hit, I was in Basel, Frankfurt, Munich, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and I'm missing one. But any which way, it was 3 weeks, that amount of travel. And what we realized is we didn't need to do that.
Yeah.
Right? We didn't need to do it. Now, not minimizing the impact on in-person contact, I think that establishes rapport, not only within your team, but within health authorities. There's value to that, but there's a balance that we now found. And I think the other piece that I probably didn't mention to you is, when I started traveling again, when I came back from Morocco in May of 2020, from my regional meeting there, I got very ill.
Oh.
With COVID. Yes.
Okay.
And I was in ICU for 3 weeks.
Wow.
I went into multi-system organ failure, heart failure, kidney failure. I was given less than a 20% chance of survival. And I was literally on my deathbed. And I realized, the priorities, not only professionally, but personally, that we could do things differently. When I came back, unfortunately, I became healthy. And it kind of changed how I viewed, travel with the blend of my illness and COVID. It kind of like changed my perspective as a leader and as a human being.
I mean, I can't imagine. Thankfully, I've never been that ill. Even if I did have COVID, I've never really tested positive for it, so I'm a bit lucky. I remember when COVID came out, all the different rumors of who was susceptible and who was going to get it worse, and I think I ticked every single box. So I don't know how I got away with not having it. But
it's funny, Indy, and this is how unpredictable the disease is, right? If you think about it, January 2020, where I was in Beijing, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. Right before it actually broke out, I never got sick.
Mm-hmm.
I have 4 kids. They all got it. My wife got it. I had all the vaccines. I never lived my life in isolation when they got it. And the irony is I got it much later, and I got sicker than everybody else.
Unbelievable. And I mean, we won't dwell on COVID too much, but it is the one thing that I believe has completely changed our safety profile within companies. I've spoken to quite a lot of people who we talk about COVID potentially being the point where, we were front page of the newspapers rather than somehow trying to explain what we do in pharmacovigilance. But going back to the big three, or big four, is it could be said is tends to be how we look at the FDA, EMA, Japan, and sometimes MHRA comes in and out depending on if we're in Brexit or not. But what is making these drivers for these regions to diverse away from, or go away from the path of the big three? And also, there's been some changes from some of the, let's say, lesser known regulatory agencies like South Korea, which have made drastic changes to both system side and from a process side. What do you think these drivers are?
Well, that's a little bit tough to answer, because a lot of times you can't get into the mentality of the health authorities.
Mm-hmm.
So we still have to focus on the big health authorities because a lot of, it's a trickle down effect where people or different health authorities still, especially emerging health authorities, they still defer to the guidance from the big three, four, we say the big five and six within Novartis, right? And a lot of the bigger companies will look at those big five or six. However, we're seeing that departure where, the Korean Health Authority, the Chinese Health Authority, right? They are really now going into very domestic, and I don't want to use the word unrelated, but very specific to their local health authority and their demands. Sometimes, in our view, and in my view, is unreasonable.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the paths that we've done, and I believe that all of industry should do, is give feedback and establishing rapport with the health authority as the legislation is being established. Now, there are two paths. One, where you have feedback, and then the second one is where legislation is established without feedback. And establishing that rapport gives you an avenue to give feedback, positive and negative. What's possible, what's not possible, from a systems perspective, from a follow-up perspective. And that's where there's a lot of value in the active dialogue with the health authority. And believe it or not, they are very willing to listen. And if you come with valid arguments, and I wouldn't say arguments, I would say feedback on what's possible, what's not possible. And if we're looking at domestic cases, right, what are they asking, right? And that's the where you have to take a step back and say, okay, what's the reason that they're asking for A, B, and C? Domestic cases in clinical trials, post-marketing. Let's see what we have available that we can get back or push back, because a lot of it is not feasible sometimes. And we've seen really positive outcomes in those dialogues with the different health authorities. Korea is a good example. China is a good example.
Wow. So maybe, well, I'm putting words into thoughts and thoughts into words even. The other question actually I had in my head was, so you went from being the head of the US and Canada, where it was very much established health and processes, I guess as well, to a much more global role. What was your checklist when you first started that role? Like, what were you like? Right, what do I need to do? What needs to be improved? Are there processes? I mean, what was going through your head as you went into that new role?
Well, understanding the demands of the travel, and this is pre-COVID, right? Mm-hmm. So, is sitting down with my family first and foremost, and my wife, my parents, my in-laws, because I knew the demand that it was going to take on my family with me traveling so much. That was the first and foremost thing. And if I had their support, I was going to move forward with this opportunity. And I did. Then it was realizing, oh, geez, I'm in over my head. I don't know what I don't know.
Yeah.
And fortunately, I was a peer to a lot of the people that were going to report to me, the regional heads. And I had to lean on them. And that's why travel was so important, to go in person and meet with them, understand their culture.
Yeah.
And, demyth some of the things that was associated with somebody coming from the US. Oh, they didn't understand the culture. And and you know what? Even though I had a huge European flavor, right? I mean, I was Portuguese and, spent so much time in Europe. I realized that I wasn't culturally adept to understanding, not only the regulatory authorities, but the cultural aspect of the different people in the countries, right? What made them tick, right? And adapt myself as a leader to what worked, not only in the region, but in countries, different countries within a region. And that was a huge learning curve for me. And I leaned on my regional heads and, you know what? And just have an open mind as a leader, push back, right? Share your experiences, especially where I came from the bottom up, right? So more or less, even though the country was different, the region was different, but a lot of the work was the same.
I see.
And that's where I needed to adapt. And it took me a few years, right, to open my mind to those different cultures, the different working environment, the different individuals. And yeah, it was one of the best experiences that I ever had as a leader. Even today, 5+ years later, I'm still learning. And that's the wonderful thing about keeping your mind open as a leader is you think you got it all figured out, but you don't. And it goes back to, and it's funny how things become parallel over the course of life. When you work in the emergency room, and it's funny, when you think you've seen it all, and somebody told me very early on in my orientation, they said, you think you've seen it all. And today, you're going to see something you never saw before, and you have to have the mental agility and the learning agility to adapt. And that's something that I've taken with me throughout my career, because every time I think I got it figured out, something comes across in Malaysia, in Thailand, in the US, in Canada, which alters your mindset. And you're like, oh, geez, I have to adapt here.
I know we've had a previous conversation where you were saying that the Middle East specifically is quite demanding with what they require. What did you mean by that?
So, especially the Saudi Health Authority and Egypt, they've adopted a lot of some of the global standards, but similar to China, they're doing a lot of domestic type of demands. And then if we look at our organization or global organization, any organization, and we look at aggregated documents, right? Usually a lot of the health authorities accept, global RMPs, PSURs in the US, USPRs in lieu of the PSURs. But now what we're seeing in these health authorities that are a little bit more domestically demanding is that they want something specific to their patient population, and something specific from a documentation perspective, an aggregated document perspective. So that becomes challenging, right? And that's some of the things that we're facing and other organizations are facing, because if they want things expedited in a certain fashion, it becomes a system issue, right? How do you suppress, going to other health authorities versus that health authority? And that's kind of what we're facing now across the globe, especially in the Middle East and in Asia Pac. We're seeing those things really create a burden. And I don't mean a burden, from a risk to a patient perspective, but a burden from a system perspective and actually making it all work. And that's kind of like where we're trying to balance, what works, and also the dialogue, going back to dialogue with the health authority.
So you touched upon systems there. Do you think that this is where AI could potentially help?
Yeah. So yes and no. And I'm not going to go into the details of what Novartis has done, but me personally, my experience in going to various conferences is we talk about artificial intelligence, right? And the utilization of artificial intelligence. The reality is, today, there is not a one-stop shop. Okay? It's not. It doesn't exist. And I can tell you, I've been in sandboxes with 17 organizations. It doesn't exist. There are tools that can definitely help with AI that are out there, but they're in silos. So if we look at the different buckets, right? Follow up, taking unstructured data into structured data, like in an inbox, in an email, translation, legal cases, things like that. We're not there from a maturity perspective. Will we get there? Absolutely. But what's going to be, what we can use that's validated, quote unquote, from a health authority perspective. So how I look at this, and I said, we can do a lot of stuff that we're seeing. However, if you're at an inspection with an FDA inspector, can you validate AI tools? Can you do that? And the answer right now is no, to some degree. Yes, there are possibilities. What's their comfort level of errors?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what feedback you've received, but this is just my experience, and it's been pretty extensive. But I think there's a future there. It's not mature yet.
Going back to another point that you made, you were talking about, previously one of your roles was doing with risk management planning. How has that interwoven with your current role? Because you were saying how, a lot of these emerging regulators are doing pharmacovigilance at a much more local level with their local populations. Does that stem from the fact that even the risk management plans also need to be very localized for their populations? And if so, is that also a difficulty in putting in those risk management plans to all those different regions?
Yeah. So, it depends on the health authority and the expectation in the regulation. Some accept, what we do from an R&P perspective, right? They'll accept it. But some health authorities do have local regulations for local R&Ps. And that's the challenge, right? That we have to do caveats for the different countries because it's regulation. Also, some countries, so if we look at an RMP, right, an RMP is broken down into several different annexes of, preclinical, clinical, et cetera. And then there are some health authorities that focus on the REMS part, which is the U.S. specific risk minimization part. And some accept that. And that's the blend that you have to kind of figure out. It's like, all right, what do they want? And that, from a core perspective, we have to balance it out. And that's been the challenge, It really has been. And it's evolving as we move forward, you know? And also the assumption that health authorities talk, right?
Yeah.
Don't make that assumption.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they are very independent in nature many times, even though they do quote unquote talk. But you see, you know, as legislation is being driven in the different countries and different regions, we realize that, you know, it's very different.
Yeah. Here's a question for you.
Sure.
Let's say you are at a startup company who, for some reason, some miraculous reason, they have a wonder drug that has suddenly been accepted by every single health authority. How would you, as a person from PV, make sure that you are covering all these regulations? And I'm saying this from a different point of view from Novartis is huge. I'm talking about a smaller company, perhaps, who have just stumbled upon this amazing drug.
Well, I'll be frank, it doesn't happen that way.
No,
it doesn't happen that way. So the one thing about PV is you're like a firefighter, right? You know, there are fires that start that you have to, you know, fight. And the one thing that we know in PV is that very unlikely that a smaller health authority will be innovative in nature in approving something. They will follow the bigger health authorities. Mm-hmm. Okay. And from a PV perspective, you always have to be guarded, right? This is great. It's going on the market. And what you have to do is look at the product. Is it new, right? Is it new in the terms of a class of drug? Okay. Because that will always bring unexpected side effects. And I'm not going to give examples from Novartis, but I have various, right? Where we went through clinical trials and things were perfectly fine. And then we go into the post-marketing setting. Remember, your clinical trial subset is much smaller than your post-marketing, set. And you have to kind of project the class, the drug, and say, from a PV perspective, what are the risks? What kind of due diligence do we do? And we've done this with various products. Hyper due diligence. Okay, we got to get ahead of the curve. We don't want the health authorities telling us what our risks are. Mm-hmm. We need to do the data collection that's appropriate to identify our risks within our RMP, within our PSURs, within our USPRs, or other local safety documents. And that is what we do. That is fundamental to what we do, is to making sure that we are ahead of the risks. And what's the ultimate goal, Indy? The ultimate goal is to safeguard patients, not protect the organization.
Yeah.
It's protecting patients. And it's not spoken enough about what we do in PD, because at the end of the day, we're all healthcare professionals. And every single one of us, you, me, my wife, my parents, whatever family members, whoever is listening here, we're all patients. And you want people like us that really have a vested interest in protecting patients. And that's what we do. So if you see a wonder drug, there's no wonder drug that doesn't have side effects. Everything has side effects. What's our job? To identify those side effects, quantify them, and communicate them appropriately to have physicians to make educated decisions in their prescribing practices. And that varies from country to country. Sorry, I hope I answered your question.
I got to be honest here. Tony, that was the most eloquent way I've ever heard PV explained to someone. Ever. I think I will quote that many, many times.
And you could quote it as much as you want because it comes from the heart.
Yeah,
I'll be honest with you. I'm really passionate about what I do. I'm really proud of what I do, and I have a wonderful team. And I've seen it in practice. I'm not going to get into details, but I've seen the safeguarding of patients' well-beings and what we do. People don't understand it unless you live it, and I've lived it.
I'm so happy that you brought it back to patients. We're on the final stretch now, and I have to ask the next question, which is the main question, really, because the podcast is called Innovation and the Future of Pharmacovigilance. So my question has to be, what's next for PV? Where do we go next? What happens next?
So it's really funny. In my view, again, this is my opinion, is we have to focus on fundamentals, right? If you go to inspections like I have, at the end of the day, there are fundamentals in how your database is run, how your clinical trials are run, how your post-marketing studies, whether it's a patient-oriented program, social media, how you collect data into your database is fundamental in whether you do risk management, signal detection. That is still fundamental. And, a lot of people that I talk to in industry, they forget about those key pillars that bring the data into your database and the evaluation of that data. Now, on the other hand, this is where the marriage of the future happens. It's garbage in, garbage out. Good data in, good data out. And that's where at least I have found, that a lot of what we look at right now is garbage. Mm-hmm. In patient-oriented programs, social media, lack of follow-up, lack of quality of what we are evaluating from a scientific perspective and what we can bring back to the regulators, patients, and the community as a whole. And that's where the future of PV for me is the marriage, right? There's a big gap in my view. But if we can data mine, right, what's out there, if we can look at, social media effectively, if we can look at patient-oriented programs is a great example. Mm-hmm. That represents more or less 50% of the volume of post-marketing cases that come into, especially the bigger companies that are really active. What kind of value are we actually getting from that data? The answer is really none. If we look at the value of what's coming in versus signal detection, right, what we do from a medical perspective, is there really any value that's changing our labeling, right? Our label, which drives prescribing practices. Is it really being done? The answer is no. Mm-hmm. I don't believe it is. Maybe in some other organizations it is. I don't see it. But if we can marry the future of PV and really doing the appropriate data mining and evaluating that from a medical safety perspective, from a risk perspective, that's where I want to be, at least as a leader. How can we do that? And get rid of the gray, right? Get rid of the BS that we're just doing exercises like, okay, we're going to enter this in, but nothing really happens. Like, it doesn't add any value.
Yeah.
And that's where I want to get to from an AI perspective. Is it going to happen overnight? No. I don't think it's going to happen. And some people will tell you 1 to 2 years. No. Unless we get the regulators on board and there's a marriage of convenience where we feel comfortable moving forward with such tools? Do we feel comfortable being in that inspection room, defending something that we did, something a little bit different? Good luck. I don't think I feel that comfortable yet. Hope that makes sense.
That was fantastic again, Tony. Thank you very much. And Tony, thank you for joining me today. There's so much more that we could talk about, and I hope to be able to talk to you again soon.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. And anybody that wants to discuss with me, I'm more than happy to talk about it.
Thank you. And that marks the end of Series 1 of the podcast. We have a special episode for the end of the year with our co-founders. But for everyone else, I'll see you in Season 2. Thank you very much.